Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a combat veteran, author, and the former senior advisor of the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So, thank you for coming back on.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thanks.
So, it appears that another war now may be in the making. That is, the U.S. Navy is building up the capabilities off the coast of Venezuela, and the White House appears to communicate more or less intentions for a regime change. Still unclear how this will be achieved, but you've been engaged in war planning in your career. How do you read the situation now? Is this actual war preparations, or is it mere intimidation to extract some political or economic concessions?
Yeah, I think it's a very serious buildup that's designed to do more than simply intimidate. I think there is a willingness to intervene in Venezuela. Keep in mind that we've had plans for this sort of thing on the shelf for years. This is not exactly new by any stretch of the imagination. Venezuela was always a potential target, let's put it that way, given Hugo Chavez, who preceded Maduro, his ideology and his connection potentially to China and Russia. So I think, unfortunately, we're on the road to some form of intervention, and I don't know what it is because, again, as I try to point out to people, the size of the country is so enormous that it's hard to imagine how 16,000 troops from the Army and 2,500 or 3,000 Marines are going to make much of a dent. There's a population of 30 million. Most of it lives in the coastal regions. So I just don't know. I mean, the question that keeps coming up is what is the specific political military objective that we're striving to achieve? And the next question, once you establish whatever that is, and I'm not sure what it is, then the question is it attainable? Can we do it? War is, as everybody points out that has any sort of common sense, is so unpredictable in its character that one wonders just exactly what we want to do. And we can talk more about that. There are a lot of things floating around inside the Beltway that we can discuss. But the problem is that I haven't heard anything from the president of the United States about what it is that he wants us to do. In fact, it's very reminiscent of LBJ's crusade to intervene in Vietnam. He never specifically said, what are we going to do while we're there? Well, we're going to support the legitimate government and fight communism. Well, I don't know, that's a slogan. That's not a military objective. And I think we did that for years and years and years without much result. So my question is, what specifically is our objective? Perhaps they've decided that to tell anybody would put it at risk, and they won't. I don't know, Glenn.
That's become a commonality, I think, among many of our conflicts of the political West. That is the lack of clear objectives and strategies. So, what do we want to obtain, and how exactly are we supposed to achieve this? Because I also hear the comments about wanting to fight narco terrorism, but again, once you start bombing Venezuela, exactly how would this objective be achieved? One complains about the lack of exit strategies, but once one hasn't actually outlined a strategy at all, it's more problematic. But what is as the possible wider consequence of this, though? Because Venezuela is, as you said, a big country, and it has neighbors. It's an economy. It's got a big population. Well, what do you think it could be? Well, one would say, oh, unforeseen consequences, but some could possibly be foreseen as well.
Well, if we follow the historic pattern, we have already infiltrated Venezuela with large numbers of operatives from the Central Intelligence Agency. We may well have assistance from others, including MI6. I don't know. Now, what will these CIA agents do in cooperation with potentially mercenary forces? Mercenary forces are easy to pick up. The problem with them is that they're not always very reliable. But if you're trying to start a war, they can certainly start something. So that's probably in the offing right now, if it's not already happening. Then the second thing is we now have two Russian destroyers anchored off the coast of Venezuela. And the question is, what does that mean? Obviously the Russians would not have anchored two warships off the coast of Venezuela in range of U.S. naval forces unless they were trying to send a signal. I think the signal is pretty obvious. Uh, you have done everything in your power, that is Washington, to destroy us in Moscow. You advanced this border of NATO to the very limits of its capability, and you've caused the deaths of probably 130,000 or so Russians and nearly 1.8 million Ukrainians, and you refuse to drop this war. You keep feeding this fire, even though I was looking at some reports yesterday. The Russians are capturing Ukrainian boys or young men who have been in uniform for exactly 1 week. And as a result, they don't know what they're doing. They obviously have no appetite for meeting their maker at this point. So large numbers are surrendering. So the Russians are asking, what are you doing? Well, they've given up on trying to persuade us to back off and put an end to this. So now they've said, we're not going to let you get away with what you've done in Ukraine, in Venezuela. And this is the new quote unquote multipolar world, the post rules-based liberal order, which I always laugh at because I never saw any evidence for real rules other than whatever we wanted to impose. So the bottom line is, I think this could blow up in our faces. If we end up in a fight with those warships and we sink them, which I would imagine we could do, it's hard to tell what might happen at that point. I mean, the Russians have the capability to target everything from essentially Lithuania all the way to Romania, and from Poland all the way to the border with France. And they could do that, and they could do an awful lot of damage in a very short period of time. So I think this is sort of the last straw for the Russians, and I think we're surprised because we've always believed, the wrong things. We believed that there's no one that can stand against us, that we're the most powerful force on the planet, and that the Russians are weak, incapable, incompetent. It's all nonsense, but that's what we've been peddled. It's a very desperately dangerous situation in that sense, and of course, the impact on the rest of Latin America is going to be huge, no matter what happens. If the Russians are absolutely challenged in the waters off of Venezuela by us, the rest of Latin America will watch carefully. And if we push this and the Russians respond, that could cause large numbers of states in Latin America to align quickly with Russia against us. Seeing Russia as, well, at least someone is willing to stand up to the evil Yankee, because they don't particularly care much for us anyway. And if you want to go back over the historical record, you can find lots of examples of disastrous interventions. I wish there was some good news, but I don't see any. I see stupidity and self-delusion on stilts.
But the objectives, which are, well, some of the goals at least, which appears to be in the pipeline, is obviously Venezuela has a lot of natural resources, and some American politicians have suggested that with all these resources, it's very unfriendly of Venezuela to align itself so closely with the Russians and the Chinese. Do you see it as the objective, not just to getting greater control over the resources, but also decouple Venezuela from these other centers of power?
Oh, no doubt. I think there are lots of people in Washington who think that we own the entire Western Hemisphere and that no one can enter the Western Hemisphere under any circumstances from outside the hemisphere without our express permission. And they cite this Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine really didn't play very significantly in the 19th century, contrary to what many people believe. We couldn't enforce it. In fact, you could make a good argument that the Royal Navy, at least until the Civil War, did a great job of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine because the Royal Navy didn't want other European powers intervening on the North American continent. No, I think the bottom line is this. Uh, we have decided, for whatever reason, and I've heard people say several things. First of all, remember Venezuela's role in helping to defeat Donald Trump in the 2020 election. This has to do with the Dominion software issue. Okay, that's fine. I don't think that justifies military intervention, but nevertheless, that comes up. The next point is the one on resources. And there are people in Washington who've sat down and tried to, quote unquote, collateralize what's in Venezuela on the assumption that it could be used to boost our economy and essentially save us from default and an economic crisis and financial collapse. The problem with collateralizing someone else's resources is that you have to go into the country, you have to assert absolute control over it. And we don't have the forces, certainly we don't have the ground forces to do such a thing. And I don't think it would be widely regarded as legitimate in the eyes of the world. It almost speaks or is reminiscent of, the arrival of Hernan Cortez in Mexico. His goal was very obvious: find as much gold as possible, pull it out, and ship it back to Spain. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like this is Operation Cortez. I don't think it'll work that way. I don't think it's necessary. But again, there are people that are upset with the fact, as you point out, that Russia and China have investments there. They both do. The Russians and the Chinese have companies operating in Venezuela. So as a result, when Maduro made his offer to Trump, which everyone I've spoken to they can't tell me the details, but they said it was very, very generous and lucrative. He was refused because I think Donald Trump has been persuaded by people that everyone else in the region needs to be booted out. Well, again, contrary to the Monroe Doctrine nonsense, we've had the French, the British, the Russians, the Spaniards in the Western Hemisphere off and on for a very long time. And we managed to cope with it and we survived it. So I don't think that's a good excuse. And I don't see how we collateralize all those riches in terms of gold and emeralds and lithium, obviously, which everybody wants access to, rare earths, plus oil and gas, even though the oil is heavy and high in sulfur content and problematic when it comes to refining. It takes longer. But you can still pull out 2 barrels of oil in Venezuela for the price of 1 barrel of oil in West Texas. That's true, and probably 3 or maybe even more out of Iran and Libya for 1 barrel out of West Texas. But do we need to do this? Do we declare war, march in wherever we like without regard to people's needs? And when you start lobbing missiles, launching all these airstrikes and missile strikes, you're going to kill a lot of people. I'm always amazed at the people that say, well, this is a precision strike operation. Yeah, well, it may be precise in a lot of ways, but unfortunately, no matter how precise you are, you're going to kill people. When you begin to kill people and the blood flows, the blood is bad blood. You begin to stimulate anger. You permanently offend people. It takes a long time to recover from that. But I don't see any evidence that anybody's really thinking this through. My impression is that there is no strategy. There isn't. I mean, other than let's push NATO out as far as we can, and hopefully we can rape and destroy Russia. I mean, that was mentioned in many times in my presence. By the same kinds of people that are currently killing people in Palestine, they are working overtime right now to go into Venezuela. So in that sense, it's linked, but it's not an American grand strategy, as far as I can tell. So I don't understand. I haven't seen any tangible, concrete evidence for systematic planning and preparation for the possibility that you destroy a government and that you create anarchy, and you are then compelled to intervene and try to restore some measure of order. That's a serious mistake. We were much better off in Iraq in 2003. We did not have to occupy that country. The army was intact because most of the army did not fight. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. You still had an administration in Iraq. So we didn't have to dismantle the administration and liquidate the army. All we had to do was replace the people at the top and say, we would like to do business with you. We can't do business with Saddam Hussein, but we will do business with you. And as soon as there's order on the streets and we have reached some sort of agreement as to how to proceed, then we will withdraw. Well, that's doable in a place like Iraq, and we blew it, made terrible mistakes. Is that doable in Venezuela? I'm not sure. Venezuela is infinitely larger, the size of what? Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland together, with 30 million people. A little more challenging. So I just don't have any good answers, but I don't see anything good happening as a result of what we're planning to do. Let's put it that way.
Well, you mentioned that obviously Russia and Venezuela, that these conflicts are linked, but it does appear now after Trump took some pride in the strike on the Russian energy infrastructure and some threats about the Tomahawk, that is putting the whole Ukraine conflict a bit on the slow burner and passing over more responsibility to Europe. At least this week we'll see next. But the situation in Ukraine is hardly stable now, though. How significant do you see this? Well, for example, the encirclement now of Pokrovsk, and in terms of changing the dynamic of the war, but also the Western involvement.
Well, I sent you something this morning. I don't know if you saw it or not.
Are the young Ukrainian?
Yeah, you might even want to consider running that because I think that's very dramatic. And I think it points to something that's very, very wrong in Ukraine.
Меня мобилизовало, я еду в часов, Яр, помоги, не хочу умирать, мне всего 23, помогите, пожалуйста.
That this man, Zelensky, seems determined to kill as many Ukrainian Christians as he possibly can. It's not just a question of fighting Russia. He's happy to denude Ukraine of people. And that is, in my judgment, a horrific war crime. It's right up there with what's happening in Gaza. Now, I don't know what the larger agenda is, but when you watch this man, this young man, you cannot help but feel sympathy for him. And it may be that the secret police, which is compares, it would seem, pretty favorably with Stalin's NKVD right now in Ukraine, that the population can't overthrow the government. They can't rid themselves of this man. This puts the Russians in a terrible position because this means they have to advance. They have to move further. And it looks more and more as though they'll move up to the river. They'll take Odessa. Now, what do they do beyond that? They don't want to go any further west. They don't want to rule or govern Ukrainians. But at some point, you have to bite the bullet and do what is necessary to secure your country. I think that's the position the Russians are in. But if we come to blows with the Russians over Venezuela because of these two warships, then I would say the slow boil that you pointed to in Ukraine will suddenly become a very high boil. In other words, the temperature will be turned up and we'll begin to see the water boil off rapidly. Because at that point, the question inside the Kremlin is, why are we exercising such restraint? The Americans mistake our restraint for weakness, and we are not weak. Number one. Number two, why do the Americans not understand what we really want? Well, they don't understand it because they refuse to listen to it. They won't even consider the legitimate security interests of Moscow. They refuse to acknowledge that Moscow not only has legitimate security interests, but it has to be treated not as a backward third world country, but as a developed state with superior military power and a great deal of economic potential as a result of all of its resources. Why can't we treat Moscow as an equal? Why do we refuse to treat China as an equal? In point of fact, we don't. We continue to pretend that somehow or another we have this innate superiority. That's an illusion. It's stupid. It's counterproductive. There's no humility in the American character right now. And this is catastrophic, I think, for the United States and the American people. So what you see in Washington is a confused morass of people without any strategic grounding, without very much experience in international policy, without a firm understanding of just how dangerous this is and how this could precipitate the thing they fear most, which is a financial collapse and economic chaos inside the United States.
Yeah, I think this is one of the flaws of Trump's strategy, though, because it seems as if his assumption is that the relative decline of the U.S. in terms of the rise of other powers, that this is caused merely by the weakness of various leaders, and if you just show enough strength, then the pieces will fall into place. But the Russians and the Chinese, being two great powers, it's interesting that they neither see the possibility of, well, essentially falling in line, but also they don't have to because of capabilities. But once that maximum pressure doesn't work, it's hard to say what is plan B. But it does appear that much of their resentment in Moscow, though, is more directed towards Europe these days, when they speak about the need for a greater deterrent and and also possibly targeting if a conflict would break out. They tend to reference the Europeans' war rhetoric. Do you see it's more likely that a conflict could emerge between the Europeans, a direct conflict that is, and the Russians, or will the Russians still remain restrained, as you suggested?
Well, the Russians have no interest in a war with Europe. That's the last thing on their agenda. They want peace with Europe. They want to do business with Europe. So if we take France and Britain, for instance, Mr. Macron has decided that he's going to send the French Foreign Legion, some 2,000 men, to Ukraine. My assumption is they'll go into Odessa. The French already have a modest presence there. But that's about as much as he can do. And the French military leadership has made it very clear that they are in no position to send anything else. I think they'll present enormous resistance to the idea. I think you have a similar situation right now in London. Starmer is in a great deal of trouble because he was making promises involving the dispatch of 30,000 British troops to fight in Ukraine without consulting anyone, without telling anyone. I think the king has now finally wakened up and intervened and will put a stop to this. I would expect Starmer to go away. And I doubt very seriously that the king or the Prince of Wales are anxious to go to war with Russia. I don't think they see any reason to do that at all. And they've already made it very clear the problems that they face that are most severe are those inside their country, involving this mass migration of people that they can't afford, they don't need, and they really don't want. So I think if you're President Putin, one of the things that he has counseled privately, I'm quite certain of this, is patience regarding Europe. If the Russians are willing to exercise some patience, the European governments will change. They will fall. And new people will come to power. I think that's going to happen in Britain and France. And when that happens in those two countries, it's going to be very difficult for Merz and the lunatics that support him in Germany to stay in power. And the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, is growing every day because they have an intelligent agenda that says no war. We need to restore good relations with Russia. We need to get back to the business of being a scientific industrial power and raising our standard of living and getting out of this abyss that we've fallen into. So I really think that the Russians, at least as far as Europe is concerned, have taken a good position. Now, there are some wild cards in this. One of those is Poland. This new president, Nawrocki, I think he makes a lot of sense in some areas, but he's been unwilling to step forward and fundamentally part ways with his predecessors. He needs to get rid of them. And this man, Tusk, needs to go away. They've got to get rid of these globalists that want to drag Poland into a war that Poland doesn't need and doesn't want. So I don't know what will happen in Poland. I think we have to watch that very, very carefully, at least as carefully as we watch what happens in Berlin. But I have a certain amount of confidence that the Germans will climb out of this pit of despair that they're in, and they will throw Merz out. Now, beyond that, I think they'll find a way to end this conflict with Russia because it just makes no sense. You got Slovakia and Hungary, and to a lesser extent, Serbia, even though Serbia has been playing both sides of the fence, unfortunately. Nevertheless, their population is very pro-Russian. And I think the Hungarians and the Slovaks are not necessarily pro-Russian. They're pro-peace. They're simply anti-war, and they see no reason to go to war. The population in Romania is quite similar. We managed to, thanks to the CIA and MI6, to install a president down there that would do our bidding. Not sure that's going to last indefinitely. So I think, again, President Putin's patience in Europe has paid off, and it will continue to pay off. And I know that's a hard pill for the Russians to swallow because the Russian people are angry. I mean, that's easy to see. You've seen that. They want action. They want an end to this. But fortunately, Putin is a thoughtful, balanced human being, and he is not guided by emotions, which is certainly an improvement over Donald Trump, who seems to be incapable of controlling his emotions.
Well, for all his flaws, I mean, if I was advising Trump, I would suggest that, as the proxy war is failing, that the interest would be to again hand over the war to the Europeans, and this is what appears that he's doing. I mean, again, it's hard to assess what he's doing because he keeps shifting so much back and forth. I never know if it's strategic or if it's just his impulses, but uh, but now there's reports of the United States withdrawing to some of its troops from some of the Central and Eastern European countries. I'm not sure if you have a clear overview over how many troops, which countries, but is there has there been a starting a withdrawal? Because this goes exactly against what the Europeans are hoping for. They want more American troops to pull the Americans further into this. But do you see the Americans winding this down and handing it over?
Well, I think that's President Trump's private wish. He certainly has already instructed us to withdraw all but a skeleton crew, for all intents and purposes, from Bulgaria and Romania. I think he would like to get out of other places as well. But remember, he is surrounded by people that are preaching the opposite. They're telling him, double down on South Korea, challenge North Korea, double down on Taiwan, challenge China, double down on the Philippines and the South China Sea, where we've already positioned missiles aimed at China. I mean, this is just blatant stupidity. There's no requirement for any of it. It's self-defeating, but he's listened to that because while he wants to disengage to the extent that he can from Europe, and I would argue he'd probably like to disengage from the Korean Peninsula and potentially Japan, he lacks the self-confidence that springs from understanding and knowledge. What do I mean by that? I may have said this before. If I have, I apologize. You can stop me halfway through this, but in the 50s, Eisenhower mused in some of his works, especially after he left office in the 60s, about what does a president need to know? And he needs to understand the international system. He needs to understand the economy. Not just the domestic economy, but the global economic system. He needs to understand the military, how it works or how it does not work, and what it can and cannot do. And then finally, he needs to know how to get himself elected. Now, everybody who comes to that office has figured out how to get elected. That's how they arrive. That's fine. The problem is that very few people arrive. In fact, I would argue the last person that arrived with anything more was probably Richard Nixon. And prior to Richard Nixon, it was Eisenhower. Now, JFK, John F. Kennedy, learned a great deal while he was on the job. And I think had he been elected to a second term, I think he would have been much more effective and done a great job. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But the rest of them haven't learned. They're not really interested. And I think that applies to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump would much rather go to a world wrestling event in Las Vegas than sit down with foreign leaders talking about anything. That's where he's comfortable. He loves interacting with his supporters. That's why he likes to hold these rallies and speak to them. He sees that as leadership, and he equates a lot of that with governing. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And so we're expecting him to essentially embrace greatness. Now, what do I mean by that? Greatness means you recognize the limits of your power. You recognize the limits of your interests. It's back to Palmerston, who said the British Empire has, only permanent interests and no aspirations beyond that. No permanent allies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests. I don't think that works with him. He personalizes everything. Oh, I get along well with him. He's a friend of mine. All that is rubbish in international relations. Everything turns on interests. I doubt seriously that President Trump has ever sat down and said to anybody, tell me what our interests are in country X. Then tell me who else has interests in country X. I don't see that happening. And if you don't sit down and recognize who has the interest and who does not, you cannot also come to terms with the reality of your limitations. And again, historically, we are a naval power and an aerospace power. We are not really a land power. We have only occasionally raised large armies to fight. Really, the Civil War and what we did during the Spanish-American War was quite modest. Then we got to the First World War and the Second World War, and we began maintaining larger ground forces to stay in Europe. That's over. And I think he understands that's over. But translating that into something positive, into a new global construct, is something he's not prepared to do. I don't think he's inclined to think that way because he's got everybody around him. They're all clinging tenaciously to the order that is already dead. I don't know how else to put it.
Well, traditionally, the US had this what's been referred to as an offshore balancing strategy, though, that is exactly avoid the presence on the Eurasian continent, as it would be costly for the Americans, and also it would incentivize this collective balancing. Now, I think that was
Wait a minute, that's a 19th century mentality. We do not live in the 19th century. Technology has changed. We don't have to place ships off the coast of North Africa to threaten anybody. And the Russians don't have to place ships really off the coast of the United States to threaten us. In other words, technology has changed. We have the means at our disposal to annihilate each other. End of story. Quickly. So this business of, well, I've got a big Navy out there and everybody's impressed with it, that's crap. That is just crap. Eddie Ludwig, many years ago, talked about this. I think this goes back to the 1980s, where he described the aircraft carrier that shows up off the coast of Lebanon. I think that's where it was. And he says, what a beautiful picture. You're looking at the ocean. You can't ask for a more beautiful picture of American power. And you listen to all of these buffoons say, this is 4.9 miles, square miles of American power and territory and all this crap. Nobody ashore gives a damn what happens on that aircraft carrier. And your ability to influence what's ashore from offshore is extremely limited. Very limited. So I think we got to get out of the 19th century. We still have people behaving as though this is pre-World War I. Send the gunboats. And I think this is the problem with President Trump. This is the 21st century. No one needs to send a gunboat anywhere to do enormous damage to us if we provoke them. And that's why I'm very concerned about these two Russian ships. And I think we have a choice. We can say, well, the Russians have commercial interests in Venezuela, and so do the Chinese. We may not like it. We may prefer otherwise, but we're not going to go to war over it because it's a no-win proposition for us as well as them. Instead, we should be interested in also staking a claim inside Venezuela, and that was what Maduro offered. But we refused. Oh, he's a narco-terrorist. Call him whatever you want, but he's not a narco-terrorist. That's all nonsense, and everybody knows it. But he offered us the opportunity to do that. But it was one of these things where either we get everything or we want nothing. It's sort of a childish mentality that dominates inside the Beltway. And anybody who challenges that say, well, you're weak. You're weak. We need to be strong. We need to bully these people. That's crazy. That's insane. But we don't.
Do you think, though, you mentioned maybe Trump's also background from the entertainment industry, the focus he has on personal relationships, but also the theatrics and the optics. He's a big, he's very much into this. Do you think this makes him vulnerable to, I guess, big plays when his advisor suggests, come with these great schemes to just throw the chessboard up in the air and we'll will reorganize all the pieces, because if you can do one big swoop and rearrange the deck after decades of upend decades of a reality and create a new one, it seems like, just from the personality, I guess, something that he would be inclined, instead of going for the, like if you're with the Chinese, say, okay, we put 25, 30 years into building processing for rare earth, and, repatriating our supply chains. Instead of spending this time, it looks like he's in for the quick fix. Do you think that's part of the vulnerability to some of this, I guess, not erratic, but this big place he seems to be going for?
Well, clearly he's discovered that the tariff war is a dead end. That hasn't worked. In fact, you mentioned supply chains. What we've managed to induce is the emergence of new supply chains that no longer run through us. We're being treated as patient zero, as this sort of infectious disease carrier, and everybody wants to get away from us. Everybody wants to do business with China. I mean, that was what came out of the latest meeting where President Trump showed up with Xi and everyone else. He went to Japan, and he was so happy. They gave him a brand new set of golf clubs, perhaps the most expensive and luxurious golf clubs in history. They told him, yes, we're going to invest in the United States. Although now after the meeting, it turns out not on the scale that he'd hoped for. But the Japanese have been invested in the United States for a long time. But he was also told very clearly, we are not going to stop buying oil and gas from Russia. India has not stopped buying oil and gas from Russia. He went to South Korea, and the president of South Korea gave him a replica of the Korean Khanate's crown. And his only complaint was it wasn't the original. I just wanted the original. But the point is that people have learned how to play him, and he loves to be flattered. I mean, one of the most strikingly depressing scenes has been these cabinet meetings where cabinet members fall all over themselves to tell President Trump, wow, thanks to your brilliant leadership, you have saved America. Okay, great. And this sort of thing is outrageous nonsense. That may have worked with Louis XIV, although I think Louis XIV had more brains than that and understood things a little bit better, although he bankrupted France with too many wars. Bonaparte, it was much harder to flatter your way into Bonaparte's goodwill. My point is that this is counterproductive, and it's worse than that. It's depressing to watch. And I think that's a huge problem. There's no question about it. And everybody that's worked with him knows that's how you get somewhere. You flatter him and tell him how wonderful he is and how brilliant he is and how everyone is dependent upon him, and he's brought goodness and happiness to everyone. So what we need is rationality and cold, hard calculus. And we need something else. We need a recognition that sailing around the country and starting wars against people we don't like is a bad idea. We have to find a better way forward. This is the 21st century, not the early 19th or the early 20th. Things have changed. We should be interested in dealing decisively with our debt. And that means that you sit down with the people that hold it and you come to some sort of resolution as to how far you're going to go in the future and how much they're willing to write off on the basis of the policies you say you're going to pursue. And one of those policies has to be cuts in spending. I see no evidence that anyone is willing to cut any spending. So it strikes me that we'll just go over the cliff, and until we hit bottom and splack, we're finished, nothing will change.
Yeah, that touched on my last question, because all of this talk about the adjusting to multipolar realities. By the way, that also applies very much to the Europeans. It's the whole thought here should be that now it can be done in organized way. If things goes terribly bad, it would be very disorganized if one has to make adjustments in the middle of a severe financial crisis. But the U.S. just ticked into now over $38 trillion in debt, and again, as you said, the tariff war isn't going well. The wider economic war isn't going that much better either, and I know I get the impression the Americans are doing better than the Europeans at least, but how far can this go before things start going south? Because with each new threat, not only is the U.S. and the Western economy is taking another hit, but you also see that the rest of the world, primarily led by the Chinese and Russians, seek to make themselves immune to further economic coercion by essentially decoupling from technologies and industries and banks and currencies. So, do you have any not a crystal ball, but do you see any pathway how this is developing?
Well, there's an analogy based upon my experience in the military. And the reason I mention this is that if you look at these so-called transformation programs, in other words, we're going to become whatever we need to be in the future, and we're going to do that magically. Just give us more money and we'll fix everything. Inevitably, nothing changes. You get another version of the old force. You don't get anything new. There is no real experimentation because the people in charge, they are invested in maintaining as much of the status quo as they can, because to change the status quo is frightening to them. They're worried about losing their jobs or being edged out. So I was reading the guidance from Secretary Hegseth last night, and he made lots of interesting remarks, but then he had this phrase, rebuilding the army. Why? What do you want to rebuild? That's not what we need for the future. We should not rebuild anything that we have right now. What we need to do is go through this arduous process of figuring out what it is that we do need. We have the same thing going on right now inside the economy. And we are not building a productive economy. We are being led around by the nose by what I would call financial capitalists, people that have made billions of dollars with apps, applications that take a certain amount of money away from you and put it in their pockets and then transfer the money somewhere else. In other words, we're not building anything, with the exception, of course, I think, of Elon Musk, who deserves credit for this. He's building things, and as a result, he is creating employment. And what he's building is productive in the sense that it could become a mainstay over the long term, foundationally speaking, of our economy. But the rest, no, not really. And we haven't thought through anything. I'm inundated all the time with people asking about rare earths, and I have involved myself in that for some time now, a couple of years at least. And it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. There is no coherent strategic approach to anything in Washington. There is no scientific industrial strategy. There is no high technology strategy. There is no agrarian strategy. We used to produce more food than almost anybody else on the planet. Why aren't we doing that now? Why did we slaughter 1 million head of cattle? Why are we buying beef from Argentina when we have plenty of beef that we can grow and exploit here in the United States? Well, we've made a lot of bad decisions that were all designed to be short-term profit. And I think that's the American problem. We are the microwave nation. You take, oh, here it is, put it in the microwave, boom, hit the button. A minute later, out comes your finished product, whatever it is. That's not the way things work. And we're dealing with people in China and Korea and Japan, Vietnam, Russia, Iran, almost everywhere, that is very, very different from us in that regard. And I'm afraid the Europeans, especially the West Europeans, have made the fatal error of imitating us and becoming equally short-term in their horizon, in their look into the future. All of this has to change, but you say, how long will this happen and when will this happen? When it can't go on, when everything just locks up. It's like an old locomotive. It's clear you need a new locomotive. You got to pull this thing off the rails. You got to put a new locomotive on the rails in order to pull the train. Nobody wants to stop. Oh, that'll take too long. That's too expensive. We could just make some modest changes here in the margin. We'll be fine. Doesn't work that way. So our locomotive is in a lot of trouble. It's running out of steam. But nobody wishes to admit that. Instead, we stand up and say, we are the greatest. We have the best. We are this. We are that. No one can stand against us. I think we're going to get an education.
Yeah, the French philosopher Emmanuel Todd, he makes the point that he calls it micro-militarism, when one goes after these small military targets to express greatness, that this is often something historically you see during eras of decline. As you suggested, if you have to remind everyone how great you are every second minute, and maybe we're losing our greatness there. But
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, you're 100% on target. And I don't know how to fix that other than to wait until the locomotive breaks down and everybody gets off the train and says, what happened? And then perhaps we can get something else on the tracks and get somewhere else other than where we're headed. I don't know.
well, thank you so much for taking the time. I always love to get your perspectives and pick your brain. So thanks again.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.